the stranger rode into Eureka Springs, Arkansas on a dusty Tuesday afternoon in June of 1882. And Willa Forsythe knew without looking twice that he would be gone before the week was out, because men like him always were. She was scrubbing the porch boards of her modest homestead when the sound of hoofbeats made her glance up, squinting against the glare of sunlight that filtered through the oak trees lining the dirt road. The rider sat tall in his saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the bright sky, and even from a distance she could see the way his hand rested near his holster, the practiced ease of someone who had spent more nights sleeping under stars than roofs. Willa returned to her scrubbing, the bristles of her brush working soap into the weathered wood. She had seen enough drifters pass through this town to recognize the signs. They came through Eureka Springs with increasing frequency these days, drawn by rumors of work at the nearby lumber mills or the promise of cheap whiskey at the saloons that lined Center Street. Most stayed 3 days, maybe 4. The restless ones never made it past 2 sunrises before the itch to move on took hold of them again. She was 23 years old and had lived in this house her entire life, first with her parents and now alone since their passing 2 winters ago. The fever had taken them both within days of each other, leaving her with 40 acres of rocky Arkansas soil, a barn that needed constant repair, and a stubborn refusal to sell out to the land speculators who came calling every few months with their leather satchels and promises of fair prices. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, then stopped. Willa did not look up. "Afternoon, madam." The voice was deep and pleasant, with the slight rasp of a man who was not accustomed to much conversation. She sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of honey-brown hair away from her face with the back of her wrist. The stranger had stopped his horse at the edge of her property, near the split-rail fence that marked the boundary between her land and the road. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck beneath his worn hat. His eyes were a startling shade of blue, the color of the sky just after dawn. "Afternoon," she replied, her tone neutral. "I am looking for work," he said. "Heard in town there might be folks needing help with their land." Willa studied him for a long moment. He had the look of a man who had traveled far, his clothes dusty from the trail, his face tanned from long days in the sun. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, looked well cared for despite the journey. That told her something. A man who treated his animals right might be worth considering. "Who sent you out here?" she asked. "Blacksmith in town. Said you had some fence work that needed doing, maybe some other repairs." She made a mental note to have words with Carl Henderson. The blacksmith meant well, but she had not asked him to send workers her way. Still, it was true that the fence along the northern pasture had taken damage during the spring storms, and the barn roof had been leaking for the better part of a month. "I cannot pay much," she said finally. "Room and board would be enough," he replied. "And whatever you think the work is worth when it is done." She stood, wiping her damp hands on her apron. This was the part where she should send him away, tell him she could manage on her own as she had been doing for 2 years. But the truth was that the work was piling up faster than she could handle it, and pride would not fix a collapsing fence or a leaking roof. "What is your name?" she asked. "Jacob Emerson," he said. "Most folks call me Jake." "Well, Mr. Emerson, I am Willa Forsythe. You can stable your horse in the barn, and there is a bunkhouse out back. It is not much, but it is dry and clean." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or relief. He touched the brim of his hat. "Much obliged, Miss Forsythe." She watched as he guided his horse toward the barn, noting the way he moved with an easy grace that spoke of countless hours in the saddle. Then she returned to her scrubbing. trying to ignore the small voice in her head that whispered she had just made either a very good decision or a very foolish one. That evening, after Jake had settled his horse and stowed his gear in the bunkhouse, Willa prepared a simple supper of cornbread, beans, and salt pork. She had debated whether to invite him to eat in the house or bring a plate out to him, but good manners won out over caution. Her mother had raised her to treat workers with respect, and that meant a seat at the table. Jake knocked on the door just as the sun was beginning to set, his hat in his hands and his face freshly washed. She noticed he had changed his shirt, trading the dusty trail clothes for a clean but faded blue cotton shirt that matched his eyes. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. He moved carefully through her home, as if aware that his presence disrupted the careful order she had created in her solitary life. The house was small but well kept, with lace curtains her mother had made framing the windows and a rag rug covering the wooden floor near the hearth. They sat at the table and Willa served the food, the silence between them stretching but not uncomfortable. Finally, Jake spoke. "This is good," he said, gesturing to the meal. "I have not had home cooking in quite some time." "Where are you from?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. She did not usually pry into the lives of strangers. "Kansas, originally," he replied, "but I have been moving around for the past 8 years or so. Worked cattle drives in Texas, tried my hand at mining in Colorado, did some ranch work in New Mexico." "That is a lot of places," she observed. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his plate. "I suppose I never found a reason to stay put anywhere." There was something in his voice, a hint of loneliness that she recognized because she felt it herself sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn. She wanted to ask more, to understand what drove a man to wander from place to place with no roots and no home, but she held her tongue. His past was his own business. "The fence work is the priority," she said instead, steering the conversation to safer ground. "The northern pasture. Then the barn roof if you have the skill for it." "I can handle both," he assured her. "I will start first thing in the morning." True to his word, Jake was up before dawn the next day. Willa heard him moving around outside as she prepared breakfast, the sound of tools being gathered, and the soft nicker of his horse greeting the morning. She found herself watching through the window as he headed toward the northern pasture, his stride purposeful and steady. She spent the morning tending her vegetable garden and doing the washing, but her thoughts kept drifting to the man working on her fence line. She told herself it was simple curiosity, nothing more. By noon, she had prepared sandwiches and lemonade, and she carried them out to where Jake was working. He had made impressive progress, having already replaced several damaged posts and restrung a good length of wire. His shirt was damp with sweat despite the shade from the oak trees, and he had rolled up his sleeves to reveal forearms corded with muscle. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, holding up the basket. He straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "That is mighty kind of you, Miss Forsythe." They sat in the shade of a large oak, eating in companionable silence. A breeze rustled through the leaves above them, bringing with it the scent of honeysuckle and wild roses. "You have good land here," Jake said, looking out over the rolling pasture. "Must have taken a lot of work to keep it going on your own." "It has its challenges," she admitted, "but it is home. My grandfather homesteaded this property back in the 50s, built the house and barn with his own hands. No other family to help," she shook her head, "just me now. My parents passed 2 years ago." "I am sorry," he said, and the genuine sympathy in his voice made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you," she managed. "Some days are harder than others, but I manage." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Takes a strong person to hold onto a place like this alone. Lot of folks would have given up." "This land is all I have of them," she said simply. "I will not let it go without a fight." Something in her words seemed to resonate with him. He nodded slowly, his blue eyes thoughtful. "I can respect that." The days fell into a rhythm after that. Jake worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences and then moving on to the barn roof. Willa found herself looking forward to their meals together, the conversations that grew longer and more personal as the initial wariness between them faded. She learned that he had grown up on a small farm in Kansas, the youngest of 4 brothers. His father had been a hard man, quick with his fists and stingy with praise. When Jake turned 18, he had left home with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back, determined to make his own way in the world. "I told myself I would never be tied down to one place," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. "Never wanted to end up like my father, bitter and broken from trying to force crops out of ground that did not want to give them." "But you have been moving for 8 years, Willa observed. "Has that made you happy?" He was silent for a long moment. "I thought it would," he said finally. "Freedom, no responsibilities, nothing holding me back. But lately, I have been wondering if maybe I was just running from something instead of running toward anything." She understood that feeling better than she cared to admit. After her parents died, she had thrown herself into the work of maintaining the property, telling herself that as long as she stayed busy, she would not have to face the crushing loneliness that waited in the quiet moments. "I think we all run from something," she said softly. "The question is whether we eventually find the courage to stop." He turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were dark and searching. "Maybe some of us just need the right reason to stop." Her heart beat a little faster at the intensity of his gaze, but she forced herself to look away, to remember that men like Jacob Emerson never stayed. In the weeks since he had arrived, she had grown accustomed to his presence, to the sound of his voice and the way he made her feel less alone in the world. But that only made it more dangerous, because when he left, and he would leave, the loneliness would cut that much deeper. On the 7th day, Jake finished repairing the barn roof. Willa paid him what she could spare from her small savings, knowing it was less than the work was worth, but hoping he would accept it with grace. He took the money with a nod of thanks, then surprised her by saying, "I noticed your well pump is looking worn. If you have the parts, I could fix it before I move on." "Before you move on," she repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "Of course. Where will you go next?" He shrugged, but something in his expression seemed uncertain, almost troubled. "I heard there might be work in Fort Smith. Or maybe I will head west again, see what is out in the territories." "Sounds like you have it all planned out," she said, hating the edge of hurt that crept into her voice. "Willa," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with something. "It is fine," she said quickly. "I knew you would not stay. Men like you never do, men like me," he asked, and there was a note of something almost like pain in his voice. "Drifters," she said. "You told me yourself you never stay anywhere longer than a week. I should not have expected anything different." She turned to walk back to the house, but he caught her arm gently. "Wait," he said. "Please." She stopped but did not turn around, not trusting herself to look at him without revealing too much of what she was feeling. "What if I wanted to stay?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "What if I found a reason?" Now she did turn, searching his face for any sign of mockery or false promises. But his expression was open, vulnerable in a way she had not seen before. "What reason?" she whispered. "You," he said simply. "These past 7 days have been the first time in 8 years that I felt like I was home, not because of the place, but because of you. The way you talk about your land, the way you face every challenge without backing down, The way you make me believe that maybe putting down roots would not be a trap but a gift." Her breath caught in her throat. "Jake, you barely know me." "I know enough," he said, stepping closer. "I know you are brave and stubborn and kind. I know the way you laugh when something surprises you, and the way you bite your lower lip when you are thinking hard about something. I know that when I imagine riding away from here tomorrow, leaving you behind, it feels like ripping out a piece of my soul." "You said you never wanted to be tied down," she reminded him, even as hope began to bloom treacherous and bright in her chest. "I was wrong," he said. "I was not looking for freedom. I was looking for somewhere I belonged, someone I belonged with, and I think maybe I found her." Willa felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had been alone for so long, had convinced herself that she was content with her solitary life. But having Jake here had shown her what she had been missing, the joy of sharing meals and conversations, of having someone to laugh with and work alongside. "What if you get restless?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if a few months from now the wandering takes hold of you again and you leave?" He reached up and cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. "I cannot promise I will never feel the urge to see what is over the next hill," he said honestly. "But I can promise that wherever I go, I will come back to you. And given the choice between wandering alone and building a life with you, there is no contest. You win every time." "Jake," she breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first and then deeper as she leaned into him, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. The kiss tasted like promises and hope, like coming home after a long journey. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "Tell me to stay," he said. "Please, Willa, tell me you want me to stay." "I want you to stay," she whispered. "More than anything." He smiled then, a brilliant expression that transformed his whole face, and kissed her again. "Then I am unpacking my saddle for good," he said. "If you will have me." "I will have you," she said, laughing through her tears. "For as long as you want to stay." "Forever then," he said. "Because that is how long I plan on loving you." The words should have frightened her, coming so soon and from a man she had known only a week. But somehow they felt right, as if her heart had recognized something her mind was only beginning to understand. Sometimes you did not need years to know when something was real. Sometimes you just knew. That night, Jake moved his belongings from the bunkhouse into the main house. It was not entirely proper, Willa knew, but she was past caring what the gossips in town might say. She had spent 2 years doing everything by the book, being the perfect lady her mother had raised her to be, and where had it gotten her? Alone and exhausted, struggling to maintain a property that was slowly falling apart around her. They sat up late talking, making plans for the future. Jake wanted to expand the pasture, maybe buy some cattle in the spring. Willa talked about her dream of planting an orchard on the southern slope, apple and peach trees that would provide fruit for pies and preserves. "We could build a bigger barn," Jake suggested, his arm around her shoulders as they sat on the porch. "One with a proper hayloft and stalls for more horses." "We would need help," Willa said practically. "The two of us could not manage all that alone." "Then we will hire help," Jake said. "There are plenty of good men looking for honest work. And maybe someday we will have children to help out." The casual mention of children made Willa's cheeks flush, but she did not pull away. Instead, she let herself imagine it, little ones running through the house, filling it with laughter and noise. A family, something she had thought she would never have. "Maybe," she agreed softly. August brought scorching heat to Eureka Springs, the kind that made the air shimmer over the fields and drove even the hardiest workers to seek shade during the hottest part of the day. Jake and Willa worked in the early mornings and late evenings, spending the midday hours in the relative cool of the house, planning and dreaming and falling deeper in love with each passing day. One morning, Willa woke to find Jake already up and gone. She found him in the barn, working on something he had covered with a canvas tarp. When she asked what he was doing, he just grinned mysteriously and told her it was a surprise. 3 days later, he unveiled his project, a beautiful porch swing made from oak, sanded smooth and fitted together with careful precision. He hung it on the front porch, in the spot where Willa often sat in the evenings. "So you will always have a comfortable place to watch the sunset," he explained, looking almost shy as he waited for her reaction. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him soundly. "It is perfect," she said. "You are perfect." "Far from it," he said, holding her close. "But I am trying to be the man you deserve." "You already are," she assured him. They made the trip into town together that Saturday, needing supplies and wanting to make their relationship official in the eyes of the community. Willa knew there would be talk, knew that some of the older ladies would cluck their tongues and whisper about impropriety and rushing into things. But she found she did not care. Let them talk. She had found something rare and precious, and she was not going to let it slip away because of what other people might think. Reverend Morrison agreed to marry them the following Sunday, a small ceremony in the little church on the edge of town. Willa wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slighter frame, and carried wildflowers that Jake had picked that morning from the fields surrounding their property. The ceremony was simple and brief, attended by a handful of townspeople including Carl Henderson, the blacksmith, who gave Jake a hearty slap on the back and told Willa she had chosen well. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed her with such tenderness that several of the ladies in attendance sighed audibly. The ride back to the farm felt different somehow, charged with new meaning. This was their home now, not just Willa's property but the place where they would build their life together. Jake must have felt it too, because he kept glancing over at her with a smile that spoke of joy and wonder and barely suppressed excitement. That night, as they lay together in the big bed that had belonged to Willa's parents, Jake traced lazy patterns on her shoulder with his fingertips. "I never thought I could feel this way," he murmured into the darkness. "This settled, this content. Like every restless part of me has finally found peace." "I know what you mean," Willa said, turning to face him. "I thought I was content before you came, but I was just going through the motions. Now everything feels brighter, more alive. No regrets." He asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Not a single one," she said firmly. "You? Only that I wasted 8 years wandering when I could have been looking for you," he said, pulling her closer. She nestled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Maybe you needed those 8 years to become the man I fell in love with," she suggested. "Everything happens for a reason, my mother used to say." "She was a wise woman," Jake said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "She would have liked you," Willa said. "My father, too. He always said the measure of a man was not what he said but what he did, and you have proven yourself with your actions." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the windows open to let in the cool night breeze and the sound of crickets singing in the darkness. The following weeks were a blur of hard work and stolen moments of tenderness. Jake threw himself into improving the property with a dedication that sometimes amazed Willa. He truly had found his purpose, his reason to stay, and it showed in everything he did. The fence line around the entire property was repaired and reinforced. The barn roof was not just patched, but completely redone. He built a chicken coop, and they acquired a dozen laying hens from a farmer on the other side of town. Willa matched his energy, working alongside him when she could and managing the household when she could not. She put up preserves from the vegetable garden, storing them in the root cellar against the coming winter. She mended clothes and kept the house clean and cooked meals that filled Jake with appreciation and second helpings. But it was the quiet moments she treasured most. The way he would catch her hand as she passed and pull her into his lap, stealing kisses that tasted of coffee and sunshine. The way he sang old trail songs while he worked, his voice carrying across the fields to where she tended her garden. The way he looked at her each evening as they sat on the porch swing he had built, as if he could not quite believe his good fortune. October painted the Arkansas hills in shades of gold and crimson, and with it came the first real test of their new marriage. A man arrived at their door one afternoon, well dressed in a city suit and carrying a leather satchel. Willa recognized him immediately as Thomas Blackwell, one of the land speculators who had been hounding her since her parents died. "Mrs. Emerson," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I heard you had married. Congratulations." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell," Willa said coolly. "But I believe I have made my position on selling quite clear." "Ah, but that was when you were alone," Blackwell said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Surely with a husband to support now, you might reconsider. I am prepared to offer an even more generous sum than before." "The answer is still no," Willa said firmly. "Perhaps I should speak with your husband," Blackwell suggested. "Man to man, you understand. He might have a more practical view of the situation." Willa felt a flash of anger at the implication that Jake would override her wishes, but before she could respond, Jake himself appeared from around the side of the house, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone pleasant but his eyes sharp as they took in the stranger. "Mr. Emerson, I presume," Blackwell said, extending his hand. "Thomas Blackwell of Blackwell and Sons Land Company. I was just explaining to your lovely wife that I am interested in purchasing this property." Jake did not take the offered hand. "And I am sure my lovely wife explained that we are not interested in selling." "Mr. Emerson, perhaps you do not understand the reality of the situation," Blackwell said, his smile fading. "This is a lot of land for just two people to manage. The winters here can be harsh, and if you run into trouble, well, you might find yourselves wishing you had accepted a generous offer while you had the chance." There was a veiled threat in his words that made Willa's blood run cold, but Jake just stepped closer to her, his hand finding hers. "We understand perfectly," Jake said, his voice hard now. "This land belongs to my wife, has belonged to her family for 30 years, and it will belong to our children and grandchildren after us. No amount of money is going to change that, so I suggest you stop wasting your time and hours." Blackwell's face flushed an ugly red. "You are making a mistake," he said. "This territory is changing, and those who do not change with it will be left behind." "Then I guess we will be left behind," Jake said. "Good day, Mr. Blackwell." He steered Willa back toward the house, his hand steady and warm on the small of her back. They watched from the window as Blackwell climbed into his buggy and drove away, his posture stiff with anger. "That man is not going to give up easily," Willa said, worry creasing her brow. "Let him try," Jake said. "We are not going anywhere." But Willa noticed that in the days that followed, Jake started carrying his revolver again when he went out to work in the fields. He taught her how to shoot, setting up targets behind the barn and patiently correcting her stance until she could hit them with reasonable accuracy. "I do not want to scare you," he said one evening, "but men like Blackwell do not take no for an answer gracefully. I want you to be able to protect yourself if I am not here." "You think he might try something?" Willa asked. "I think it pays to be prepared," Jake said. "My father used to say that trouble avoided is better than trouble survived." His caution proved justified 2 weeks later when they woke in the middle of the night to the sound of their horses screaming in terror. Jake was out of bed in an instant, grabbing his gun and racing for the door. Willa followed close behind, her heart pounding. The barn was on fire, flames already licking up the sides of the structure. Together they managed to get the horses out along with the cow and the chickens, but the barn itself was a total loss. They stood in the yard, covered in soot and ash, watching it burn. "This was not an accident," Jake said grimly, pointing to where oily rags were scattered near what had been the barn door. "Someone set this deliberately." The sheriff came out the next morning to investigate, but he was a weak man in Blackwell's pocket, and his conclusion that it had been a lightning strike despite the clear night sky fooled no one. Jake was furious, pacing the yard with barely contained rage, but Willa put a hand on his arm. "Getting yourself arrested for going after Blackwell will not help anything," she said quietly. "We rebuild. We prove we cannot be driven away." "He tried to kill our animals," Jake said, his voice shaking. "Could have killed us. But he did not," Willa said firmly. "We are still here, still standing, and we are not going anywhere." Her words seemed to reach him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry I brought this trouble to your door." "You did not bring anything," Willa said fiercely. "Blackwell has been trying to force me out since before we met. If anything, having you here makes me stronger, not weaker." They rebuilt the barn over the next 6 weeks, with help from Carl Henderson and a few other townspeople who were disgusted by Blackwell's tactics, even if they were too afraid to speak out publicly. It was smaller than the original structure but sturdier, built with green lumber that would not burn as easily. Jake installed metal latches and bolts, making it as fireproof as he could manage. Blackwell made no more overt moves, but they both knew he was still watching, still waiting for them to fail. It added a layer of tension to their lives that Willa hated, but it also brought them closer together. They relied on each other absolutely, trusting in their partnership to see them through. Winter came early that year, bringing snow and ice that turned the world white and silent. Jake had prepared well, stockpiling firewood and feed for the animals, sealing the drafts in the house. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud from the Bible and the few books Willa's parents had owned, or just talking about their hopes and dreams. It was during one of these evenings that Willa realized she had not bled in nearly 3 months. At first, she had attributed it to stress from the fire and the ongoing tension with Blackwell. But as December turned to January and she began to feel queasy in the mornings, the truth became unavoidable. She was carrying Jake's child. The realization filled her with a complex mixture of joy and fear. Joy because she wanted this, wanted to build a family with Jake and fill their home with children. Fear because childbirth was dangerous, because they were still struggling to get back on their feet after the fire, because the world felt uncertain and threatening. She waited until she was sure, until Dr. Matthews in town had confirmed her suspicions, before telling Jake. She chose a quiet evening after supper when they were sitting together on the porch swing despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and watching the stars. "Jake," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she assured him. "Better than fine, actually. I am going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her as if he had not quite processed the words. Then understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by such pure, undiluted joy that it brought tears to her eyes. "A baby," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," she confirmed, laughing as he swept her up in his arms, blankets and all. He spun her around, heedless of the cold, then set her down gently as if suddenly afraid he might hurt her. "When?" he asked. "Are you all right? Do you need anything? Should you be sitting out here in the cold?" "Jake, breathe," she said, cupping his face in her hands. "I am fine. Dr. Matthews says everything looks good. The baby should come in early July." "July," he repeated, then kissed her with such tenderness that more tears spilled down her cheeks. "I am going to be a father." "You are going to be a wonderful father," she said. "I have seen how gentle you are with the animals, how patient. Our child is going to be so loved." That night, they made plans sprawled across their bed, Jake's hand resting protectively on Willa's still flat stomach. They would need to make more money, Jake said. He could hire himself out for work on other farms during the slow season, or maybe take a job at one of the lumber mills. They would need to prepare a nursery, baby clothes, a cradle. "My grandmother's cradle is up in the attic," Willa said. "My father slept in it, and I did too. We can bring it down and fix it up." "I will build a new one," Jake said. "Something special just for our baby." She did not argue, recognizing that he needed to do this, to provide and protect and make everything perfect for the child they had created together. The winter passed slowly, but Willa did not mind. She was content to stay warm inside, sewing tiny clothes and knitting soft blankets while Jake worked on the cradle in the evenings. He carved intricate designs into the wood, patterns of leaves and vines that spoke of growth and life. Spring arrived late, bringing with it the relief of warmer weather and the promise of new beginnings. Willa's body changed, her belly swelling with their growing child, and Jake treated her like she was made of glass. He insisted she rest more, work less, eat more. It was sweet but sometimes frustrating, and she had to remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time. "Not my wife," he said stubbornly. "Not carrying my child. I will not take any chances." She loved him for it, even when it drove her to distraction. In April, they received unexpected news. Thomas Blackwell had been arrested for fraud and arson, his schemes having finally caught up with him when he tried the same tactics on a property owned by a state senator. The senator had resources Willa lacked, including a good lawyer and connections to the federal marshals. Blackwell's carefully constructed empire of intimidation came crashing down, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The relief Willa felt was profound. The shadow that had been hanging over them was finally gone, and they could focus on building their life without constantly looking over their shoulders. Jake celebrated by expanding the vegetable garden and purchasing 3 young steers to start their cattle operation. Money was still tight, but they were managing, and the future looked brighter than it had in months. Summer arrived hot and humid, and Willa grew increasingly uncomfortable as her due date approached. She was huge, she complained to Jake, who assured her she was beautiful and glowing. She told him he was biased, but secretly she treasured his words. On a sweltering night in early July, Willa woke to the first pains of labor. Jake immediately went into a panic, rushing around gathering supplies and insisting they needed to fetch the doctor right away. "Jake, calm down," Willa said, breathing through a contraction. "We have time. First babies usually take a while." But he insisted on riding into town anyway, returning with Dr. Matthews and Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's wife, who had attended dozens of births, and had a calm, capable manner that immediately put Willa at ease. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Jake paced the hallway outside the bedroom, forbidden from entering by Mrs. Henderson, who told him firmly that he would only be in the way. He wore a path in the floorboards, jumping at every sound, every cry that came from beyond the door. Finally, as the sun was beginning to set on the second day, a new cry joined Willa's. the thin, reedy wail of a newborn baby. Jake burst through the door despite Mrs. Henderson's protests, his eyes wild with worry until he saw Willa propped up in bed, exhausted but smiling, holding a small bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had knitted. "A boy," she said softly. "We have a son, Jake." He crossed to the bed on shaking legs, sitting carefully on the edge and reaching out to touch the baby's tiny fist. The infant's fingers immediately curled around Jake's much larger finger, gripping with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You are both perfect, meet James," Willa said. "After your grandfather, James Robert Emerson." Jake looked at her with such love and gratitude that it made her heart ache. "Thank you," he said. "For him, for everything, for giving me a reason to stop running." "Thank you for staying," she replied. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, of learning how to care for their tiny son and marveling at every small thing he did. Jake was a devoted father, taking his turn walking James when he cried at night, changing diapers without complaint, singing the old trail songs in a soft voice that usually soothed the baby to sleep. Willa watched him with their son and fell in love with him all over again, seeing the gentleness and patience he brought to fatherhood. He had been right when he said he was not running toward anything during those 8 years of wandering. But he had found his destination now, in this small house on 40 acres of Arkansas land, with a wife who loved him and a son who depended on him. As summer turned to autumn and then to winter again, their life settled into a comfortable rhythm. James grew strong and healthy, his blue eyes the exact shade of his father's, his laugh a sound of pure joy that filled the house with warmth. They celebrated his first birthday with a cake Willa made and a wooden horse that Jake had carved during the long winter evenings. The farm prospered under Jake's careful management. The 3 steers had become a herd of 20, providing a steady income when Jake drove them to market each fall. The vegetable garden produced abundantly, and Willa's preserves and pickles became sought after in town, bringing in extra money. They hired a young man named Daniel to help with the heavy work, a quiet 17-year-old whose family had fallen on hard times and who was grateful for steady employment and fair treatment. When James was 2 years old, Willa discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with calm joy rather than excitement and panic. They knew what to expect now, felt prepared for the challenge of adding another child to their family. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1886, an easier birth than James had been, much to Jake's relief. They named her Catherine, after Willa's mother, and she had Willa's honey brown hair and a stubborn temperament that showed itself from the very beginning. Jake adapted to being a father of 2 with the same dedication he brought to everything else. He built a larger table so they would have room for their growing family, expanded the house to add another bedroom, taught James to ride a gentle old mare they had purchased specifically for the children. Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters when money was tight, and they worried about making it through. There were illnesses, the constant fear that gripped every parent's heart when their child ran a fever or developed a cough. There were disagreements and arguments, because even the strongest love had its moments of friction. But through it all, they had each other. Jake never stopped looking at Willa with wonder, never stopped being grateful for the day he rode into Eureka Springs and found his home. And Willa never stopped thanking whatever Providence had brought a wandering cowboy to her door and convinced him to stay. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working alongside his father, learning everything Jake could teach him about caring for the land and the animals. Catherine was wild and free-spirited, always getting into mischief, always making them laugh with her antics. When James was 8 and Catherine was 6, Willa gave birth to twins, 2 more boys they named Thomas and William. Jake joked that they were going to need to expand the house again, but his eyes shone with pride and love as he held his sons. The farm continued to grow and prosper. They had a substantial herd now, and Jake's reputation as a fair dealer and honest rancher had spread throughout the region. Young men sought him out for work, knowing they would be treated well and paid fairly. The vegetable garden had become almost a small farm unto itself, with Willa selling produce in town and teaching Catherine the art of preserving and pickling. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jake gave Willa a beautiful locket engraved with their initials and the date they married. Inside were tiny photographs of their 4 children, a reminder of the family they had built together. 10 years, he said, fastening it around her neck. 10 years since I rode into town thinking I would stay a week and then move on. What changed your mind? Willa asked, even though she knew the answer. She just loved hearing him say it. You changed my mind, he said, pulling her close. You and the life we have built together. I was running for so long, Willa, looking for something I could not name. And then I found you, and suddenly everything made sense. This is where I belong, with you, with our children on this land. This is home. You unpacked your saddle for good, she said softly, remembering that first week, the uncertainty and fear she had felt that he would leave, the joy when he promised to stay. Best decision I ever made, he said, and kissed her with all the passion and tenderness of their wedding day. More years passed, blessed and full. They added more rooms to the house as their children grew and needed their own spaces. They weathered droughts and floods, good years and lean years, always together, always supporting each other. James at 18 was nearly as tall as his father, with the same blue eyes and quiet strength. He had started courting Emily Porter, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and Jake teased him about following in his father's footsteps, marrying young and starting a family. Catherine at 16 was beautiful and headstrong, determined to become a teacher despite Jake's initial protests that it was not necessary for a rancher's daughter to have such ambitions. Willa had supported their daughter, and eventually Jake had given in, proud even if he would not admit it of Catherine's intelligence and determination. The twins at 10 were inseparable, always getting into trouble together but also fiercely protective of each other and their siblings. They had Jake's love of the land and Willa's quick mind, a combination that promised great things for their future. One evening, as Willa and Jake sat on the porch swing he had built so many years ago, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, Willa rested her head on his shoulder. "You ever miss it?" she asked. "The wandering, the freedom of the open road." Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes I remember what it was like," he said finally. "The excitement of seeing new places, the thrill of not knowing what was around the next corner, but miss it? No, because I have everything I could ever want right here. A wife I love more with each passing year, children who make me proud every single day, a home and land that I have helped build and nurture. This life we have created together is worth more than all the adventures and freedom in the world." "I love you, Jake Emerson," Willa said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, Willa Emerson," he replied. "Thank you for giving a drifter a reason to stay." "Thank you for staying," she said. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The sounds of their children's laughter drifted from inside the house, along with the warm glow of lamplight through the windows. The land stretched out around them, 40 acres that had become so much more than property. It was legacy, history, home. Jake's saddle, the one he had unpacked on Willa's porch that first day, hung in the barn, gathering dust now except for the occasional ride into town. It was a relic of his former life, a reminder of the man he had been before he found his true purpose. Sometimes Jake would look at it and remember the restlessness, the constant searching, and he would feel grateful all over again that he had found what he had been looking for in the most unexpected place. As the years continued to unfold, their family grew even larger. James married Emily Porter in a beautiful ceremony at the church in town, and within 2 years, they had blessed Jake and Willa with their first grandchild, a baby girl named Sarah. Jake cried when he held his granddaughter for the first time, overcome with emotion at the continuation of the family line he and Willa had started. Catherine did become a teacher, teaching at the small schoolhouse in Eureka Springs and earning a reputation for her dedication to her students. She married at 22, choosing a lawyer from Little Rock named David Fletcher who admired her intelligence and independence. They settled in town but visited the farm often, their 3 children eventually becoming as familiar with the land as Jake and Willa's own children had been. The twins both chose to stay on the farm, working alongside their aging father to manage the now substantial cattle operation. They married sisters, a pair of lively young women from a nearby town, and built houses on the property for their growing families. Jake and Willa watched their family expand with joy and pride, their home often filled with grandchildren, and the noise and chaos that came with large family gatherings. They had lived through the transformation of the West, had seen the wild frontier of their youth become more settled and civilized. But through it all, their love had remained constant, the foundation on which everything else was built. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the farm for a celebration. Tables were set up in the yard, laden with food prepared by multiple generations of the family. Children ran and played while adults talked and laughed, sharing stories and memories. Jake stood with Willa, his arm around her waist, surveying the scene with satisfaction. His hair was gray now, his face lined with years of sun and weather, but his blue eyes were still as bright as they had been the day he rode into Eureka Springs. "Quite a legacy we have built," Willa said, leaning into him. Her own hair had silvered and her hands showed the work of a lifetime, but she was still beautiful to Jake, still the woman who had given him everything. "It all started with you taking a chance on a drifter," Jake said. "Letting me stay when you should have sent me on my way." "I knew," Willa said softly. "Even then I think I knew you were different, that you were meant to stay." James approached them, his own children in tow, and embraced his parents. "Happy anniversary, Ma, Pa," he said. 30 years is quite an achievement. "The secret is marrying the right person," Jake said, winking at Willa. "Everything else is easy after that." Their children and grandchildren laughed, having heard this wisdom many times before but never tiring of it. It was part of the family lore now, the story of how Jake the wandering cowboy had found his home with Willa, how he had unpacked his saddle and stayed for good. As the celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing and the kind of joy that only comes from family gathered together, Jake pulled Willa aside for a private moment. "I want you to know," he said, taking both her hands in his, "that every single day of these 30 years has been a gift. Every sunrise I woke up next to you, every child we raised together, every challenge we faced and overcame. I would not change a single moment of it, even the hard times." Willa asked, thinking of the fire, the drought of '89 that had nearly broken them, the winter they lost half the herd to disease. "Even the hard times," Jake confirmed, "because we faced them together and they made us stronger. They made us who we are." "I love you, Jake Emerson," Willa said, the same words she had spoken so many times over the years, but they never lost their meaning. "I love you, Willa Emerson," he replied, and kissed her softly while their family cheered and applauded. The years that followed were quieter, but no less meaningful. Jake and Willa stepped back from the daily operations of the farm, letting their sons take over while they enjoyed the role of doting grandparents. They spent long hours on the porch swing, talking and reminiscing, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once played. Jake's health began to decline when he was in his 60s, his body worn from a lifetime of hard work. He developed a persistent cough that worried Willa, though he insisted he was fine. Dr. Matthews, retired now but still making occasional house calls for old friends, diagnosed him with lung inflammation and prescribed rest, which Jake stubbornly refused to take seriously. "I am not done yet," he told Willa when she fussed over him. "I have grandchildren to teach and a wife to love. I cannot do that lying in bed all day." But he did slow down, spending more time in the house, less time working outside. Willa treasured these extra hours together, even as she worried about his failing health. They talked about everything and nothing, shared memories of their long life together, made plans for the future even though both of them knew the future was becoming uncertain. One spring morning, as the dogwoods were blooming and the world was coming alive again after winter, Jake asked Willa to walk with him out to the old oak tree where they had sat together that first week, sharing sandwiches and dreams. "This is where I first started to fall in love with you," he said, settling onto the ground with his back against the trunk. "Right here, under this tree, listening to you talk about your land and your family and your determination to hold on to what was yours." "I fell in love with you that day too," Willa admitted, sitting beside him. "Though I did not want to admit it to myself, I was so afraid you would leave." "Best thing I ever did was stay," Jake said, taking her hand. "This life, this family, it is more than I ever dreamed of having." "We have been blessed," Willa agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the birds sing and the wind rustle through the leaves. Willa noticed that Jake's breathing was labored, his face pale, and she started to suggest they return to the house. But he squeezed her hand gently. "I am all right," he said. "I just want to sit here with you for a while longer." So they sat, holding hands under the oak tree, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that would echo through generations. When Jake's breathing finally grew too difficult, and Willa insisted on helping him back to the house, he leaned on her with gratitude and love, this woman who had been his anchor and his home for more than 3 decades. Jake lingered through the summer, determined to see one more harvest, to hold his newest great-grandchild, to celebrate one more anniversary with Willa. He fought with the same stubborn determination he had brought to every challenge in his life, but in the end, his body simply wore out. He passed away peacefully one October evening, surrounded by his family, his hand clasped in Willa's. His last words were a whisper meant only for her. "Thank you for everything, my love. Thank you for giving me a home." The grief was profound, a physical ache that Willa carried in her chest. But even in her sorrow, she found comfort in the life they had built together, in the family that was Jake's living legacy, in the knowledge that they had loved each other fully and completely for every day they had been given. She lived another 10 years, watching her grandchildren grow and have children of their own, tending her garden and sitting on the porch swing Jake had built, feeling his presence in every corner of the farm. She told stories about him to the great-grandchildren who had never known him, keeping his memory alive with tales of the wandering cowboy who had found his home and unpacked his saddle for good. When Willa finally passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 77, She was laid to rest beside Jake in the small cemetery on the edge of town. Their graves overlooked the land they had loved and worked and fought to keep, a fitting resting place for two people who had found in each other everything they had been searching for. The farm remained in the family, passed down through generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story, but never forgetting the foundation that Jake and Willa had laid. The house was expanded and modernized over the years, but the original structure remained, and the porch swing that Jake had built still hung on the front porch, maintained lovingly by descendants who understood its significance. On quiet evenings when the work was done, and the sun was setting over the Arkansas hills, family members would sit on that swing and remember the story of how it all began. How a drifter who never stayed anywhere longer than a week rode into Eureka Springs one June afternoon in 1882 and met a young woman scrubbing her porch. How he worked for her for 7 days and fell in love. How he made the choice to stay and never regretted it for a single moment. It became family legend, the kind of story told to children and grandchildren as an example of true love, of commitment, of the courage it takes to stop running and start building. The saddle Jake had unpacked on Willa's porch that fateful day was preserved in the family museum, a tangible reminder of the moment when everything changed. And on the oak tree where Jake and Willa had sat together that first week and again in his final spring, someone had carved their initials inside a heart, a permanent marker of the love that had started under those branches and grown to encompass generations. Young couples from the family would visit that tree to make their own promises, to ask for blessings on their relationships, to draw inspiration from the example Jake and Willa had set. The story of Jake and Willa Emerson became more than just family history. It became a testament to the power of love to transform lives, to give purpose to those who are searching, to create something beautiful and lasting from the simplest of beginnings. It proved that sometimes the most profound journeys end not in exotic destinations, but in finding the person who makes you want to stop traveling. Jake had wandered for 8 years, covering thousands of miles, seeing countless towns and meeting innumerable people. But it was in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, in the home of a stubborn young woman with honey-brown hair and a fierce determination to protect what was hers, that he found what he had been searching for all along: a place to belong, a person to love, a reason to stay. And when he unpacked his saddle on her porch for good, he set in motion a love story that would endure long after both of them were gone, inspiring generations with its simple truth that home is not a place but a person, and that the greatest adventure is not in wandering but in finding where and with whom you truly belong. The legacy of their love lived on in the faces of their descendants, in the thriving farm that had started as 40 rocky acres and a dream, in the values they had instilled in their children about hard work, commitment, and the importance of family. Every wedding in the family included a reading of the story of how Jake and Willa met, a reminder to new couples of what real love looked like and what it required. As the decades passed and the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the farm adapted and changed with the times. But the core of what Jake and Willa had created remained unchanged, a sanctuary of family and love built on the foundation of two people who had taken a chance on each other and never looked back. Visitors to the farm, whether family or friends, always remarked on the sense of peace and belonging that seemed to permeate the property. It was as if the love Jake and Willa had shared had soaked into the very soil, creating an atmosphere where people felt welcomed and valued. Many said they could feel the presence of the original couple, watching over their descendants with pride and joy. The porch swing became almost a sacred spot, where important decisions were made and deep conversations were held. Proposals happened there, with nervous young men asking for the hands of beloved women. Difficult news was shared there, with family members seeking comfort in the familiar creak of the wood and the view of the land that had sustained them for generations. Babies were rocked there, continuing a tradition that stretched back to when Willa had first soothed James to sleep in Jake's arms. Every year on the anniversary of Jake and Willa's wedding, the family gathered at the farm for a celebration, honoring the couple who had started it all. They shared meals and memories, introduced new family members, and renewed their commitment to keeping the farm in the family and maintaining the values that Jake and Willa had held dear. During these celebrations, someone would always stand and tell the story again, even though everyone had heard it countless times. They told of the drifter who rode into town expecting to stay a week, of the woman who took a chance on hiring him despite her better judgment, of the 7 days that turned into forever. They told of the barn fire and the land speculators, of the births of children and the building of a legacy, of 30 years of marriage and a love that had weathered every storm. And at the end of the story, someone would always raise a glass and offer the same toast that had been given for over a century. To Jake and Willa, who proved that sometimes the best journeys end at home, may we all be so blessed to find our person and have the courage to stay. The family would echo the toast, drinking to the memory of the couple who had given them everything. And in those moments, the veil between past and present seemed thin, as if Jake and Willa were there among them, smiling at the family they had created and the love that continued to grow from the seeds they had planted so long ago. The story of the drifter who unpacked his saddle for good was not just history. It was a living thing, renewed and refreshed with each generation, adapted to new times but never losing its essential truth. Love was worth fighting for. Home was worth staying for. And sometimes the person you had been searching for your whole life was waiting right where you least expected to find them. Jacob Emerson had ridden into Eureka Springs, Arkansas in 1882 as a man without roots, without purpose, without hope that he would ever find either. He had left this world in 1915 as a man rich beyond measure, not in money but in love, family, and the knowledge that his life had mattered. He had built something that would outlast him, created a legacy that would echo through the ages. And it had all started with a simple decision, made in a moment of clarity under an oak tree, to stop running and start living. To unpack his saddle and stay. To love Willa Forsythe with everything he had and build a life with her that would stand as a testament to the power of commitment and the beauty of finding your home in another person's heart. That was the true story of Jake and Willa Emerson, the drifter and the woman who gave him a reason to stay. It was a story of love conquering fear, of purpose found in unexpected places, of a legacy built on the simple but profound choice to stop wandering and start belonging. And it was a story that would never truly end, as long as there were descendants to remember it and couples to be inspired by it, as long as the porch swing still creaked in the evening breeze and the oak tree still stood sentinel over the land where it all began. The farmhouse still stands today, maintained lovingly by the Emerson Family Trust, open for family gatherings and special occasions. The rooms echo with the laughter of children who play the same games their great-great-great-grandparents played, running through the same halls and climbing the same trees. The land still produces, though the cattle have long since been replaced by other ventures more suited to modern times. But the heart of the place remains unchanged. The love that Jake and Willa built their life on still resonates in every corner, every beam, every stone. It is there in the photographs that line the walls, showing progression from sepia-toned images of a young couple to full-color portraits of their many descendants. It is there in the family Bible, where births and deaths and marriages are recorded in careful handwriting spanning over a century. It is there in the stories told and retold, never losing their power to move listeners to tears or inspire them to believe in true love. And most of all, it is there in the saddle that hangs preserved in a place of honor, the saddle that Jake unpacked on Willa's porch in 1882 and never packed again. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures do not take us to distant lands, but rather bring us home to the place and the person where we truly belong. The story of Jake and Willa Emerson is complete, their journey from strangers to soulmates fully told. They lived, they loved, they built something beautiful and lasting, and they left behind a legacy that continues to inspire. Their ending was not found in departure but in arrival, not in goodbye but in hello, not in leaving but in staying. And that, in the end, is the happiest ending of all.